I'm James Falk. This is Neon Galactic. Thanks for joining us. We're a production of Keat TV out of Humboldt County, California. Thanks for watching, and thanks for going with me on this kind of exploration of all things interesting and outside the normal cognitive framework, perhaps. We're here with Chris Aubeck, who is an author. He's legendarily the co-author of Wonders in the Sky, which is one of the most sought or most quoted and recommended books on the UFO phenomenon that there are. Gary Nolan personally recommended that book to me, and I read it a long time ago, but it was fascinating, stretching back into the past about the various phenomenon and things that have been seen. So that was really well done. But he's now recently published a new book called Saucers, Tracing the Origins of UFO, Disc-Shaped UFOs. And I might be reversed here, but I'll fix that later. Great book. Fantastic. It's well illustrated, and it's impeccably researched, and it has some really interesting and complicated revelations about the saucer-shaped phenomenon that I think some people might not be comfortable with. But I want to get into that. I find it fascinating the way that you talk about priming with fiction and all sorts of other things, but we'll get into all that. First off, I want to talk a little bit about your history in the research. I read in the book that you've seen a UFO, a rectangular object in the sky. So if we could start there and then sort of move into how you became a part of the research and study of UFOs as well.
Okay, well, my UFO story, my personal story, didn't begin with the sighting, but the sighting itself happened on the 6th of April, 1996, in a small village of a town called Badajoz. It's a province called Badajoz in Spain, where I am now, in fact. And yeah, I was out one evening with a group of about 7 other people, and I was already interested in these topics. And I was very aware, too, that in the mid-90s, there had been a lot of sightings all over Spain, particularly in the south of Spain. It seemed quite a coincidence. I didn't know what to think until, of course, one night we went out and we all saw this rectangular, it really looked like a sort of rectangular shape, just like a book. It was around just under the level of the moon, I would say. The moon was in a different part of the sky that night. It seemed to be self-luminous. It was orange colored, and it was very difficult to understand. It wasn't particularly big, but it was definitely a rectangle. We could see that from where we were standing. And it was in the sky for about 10 minutes. And then people were commenting on it. And then suddenly it vanished, as if you'd turned off a light bulb. I saw the moment it vanished. It was quite something. And then a few minutes later, it appeared in a different part of the sky and stayed there for a very long time too. Of course, I wish that we'd brought a camera with us, but I mean, in that period, mobile phones didn't have cameras. Not everyone even had a mobile phone, and you wouldn't take a camera out at 11 o'clock at night normally. So unfortunately, but I certainly witnessed it with several other people. I have no idea what we saw.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, so how did you turn from that into later researching UFOs? I mean, you mentioned your prior interest. Was it just a natural evolution of that, or was it something that, the sighting sort of helped inspire you to try to get to the bottom of what you'd seen?
When I was a young teenager, I used to read a lot of science fiction, including Marvel comics, and I became very interested in folklore and mythology around the age of 14, 15. I began I became a member of the Ancient Astronaut Society, which was Eric von Daniken's organization based in Chicago. And I was 15, 16 years old. Yeah. I began corresponding with many of the writers who contributed articles for the publication Ancient Skies, that was a part of that organization. And their snail mail addresses appeared at the bottom of each article. So I had a a very wide correspondence with even Zechariah Sitchin in that period, and
Wow.
other staple figures of the field. And
Mhm.
they didn't know I was just a young teenager. Then, when I was 18, I went to America and I went to meet these people in person, at least two of which were very surprised how young I was. Then after that, I returned to England, and after several adventures there, I went to Spain. But in this period, I was sort of trying to find out whether there really was a connection between folklore and UFOs. I hadn't really looked at the books of Jacques Vallée by
Mhm.
that time, but when I discovered them, I thought, wow, we're on the same track.
Yeah.
So in 1997, well, me going to America was 1990. 1997, I was living in Spain and I sent my first ever email to him. I found his email address online. I sent him an email and he replied. And then I met him in 2003 and he said he'd like to write a book with me. So we spent several years looking into that
Wow.
possibility.
Yeah.
And then finally, of course, we wrote Wonders in the Sky, which you've already mentioned.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's oddly appropriate that your first email was to Jacques Vallée. I mean, he was perhaps one of the progenitors of the internet. So that seems like a rather cool coincidence. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, your book with, like I said, with Jacques is basically a textbook in the field. I mean, before we get into the new book, I'd like to find out where you're at now. Where do you find yourself? I mean, one thing I want to ask before we get too far in, there's an academic paper I found online, and it's called the UFO Whistleblower Hearing, and it's got your name on it,
Mm-hmm.
along with
Mm-hmm.
VJ Ballester Olmos and
Mm-hmm.
Julio. Are you an author on that?
Yeah, yeah, and
Okay,
I helped prepare that document.
okay. So
The
I guess, I
fact
mean,
is
I
that
wanted to do you agree with it, and then what's your stance on UFOs at this point?
okay, so my interest has evolved since I published that book with Jacques Vallée in 2010.
Mhm.
These days, I'm much more concerned about the layers upon layers of myth that have built around the what could be a nucleus of reality, as if it were some kind of accretion. It's
Mhm.
almost as if it was scraping off levels of sediment here, because that's what it is. If you take any flying saucer sighting and you give it 20 or 30 years, it will just get huge, very thick layers of nonsense and myth and urban legend and beliefs and whatever arguments for and against around it, which are very, very difficult to penetrate. So I've become, well, me and a lot of other researchers in the field have become more interested in the psychological, sociological, anthropological aspects of ufology. And
Mhm.
this is partly because it's very frustrating to study something that I mean, its very existence is up for debate. It's a little bit is like theology in a sense. You end up studying the works of great thinkers instead of the object itself. Nobody exactly studies God in theology, and we don't study UFOs. We're more interested in studying what may have happened and what other people have thought about it, and how that has had an impact on the lives of witnesses. I've always been I've always been quite passionate about linguistics, mythology, folklore, anthropology, and so on. And this is a field which joins all of those other areas together. It sort of intersects in a way, so I can practice my sometimes amateurish, but at least I'm trying sort of activities in those worlds of linguistics, for example, translating ancient and modern documents,
Yeah.
trying also to use modern tools like artificial intelligence to help me with that task, which is fantastic. That is a godsend to ufologists.
Mhm.
And I currently feel that I'm skeptical about 99% of what's ever been published. I'm always holding on to that little bit of hope that there's a truth there that validates the experience that's been my
That
30
you
years
had.
in the field.
And
Yeah, I mean
that you
it's
had. But
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
what do you do when you are confronted with the evidence that practically everything that's ever been written about this is untrue, but then you've also experienced it? It's a bit of a paradox in that sense.
yeah. I mean, you say 99% of what's been written about it is untrue. How do you quantify that? I mean, I've read a
Um,
lot of books, and some of them
mm,
are, they make assumptions or they make, arguments that are built on other conjectures and whatnot. So they're not necessarily fact, but why are they untrue?
okay, so for example, there's been a big research effort by a guy called Isaac Coy to gather and republish, make available every scrap of UFO information that's ever been published. That is all the fanzines and magazines and books and so on. And although it looks like a huge amount of information, it does boil down to a lot of repetition and quite a lot of fiction and manipulation by those writers. Because in the 1960s, 70s, and partly also in the 80s, there was such a boom of interest in the topic of UFOs, extraterrestrials, and so on, that there were many conflicting interests. There were a lot of people trying to make fast buck from it. When you start to look at the cases themselves, they just fall apart in your hands most of the time. That's not to say all of them do, but for example, when I was working with Jacques Vallée on getting 500 cases together for our book Wonders in the Sky, I'd say we rejected 15,000 possibly. I don't know. I mean, between the two of us. So we were left with 500, some of which even today we've also discarded, and now we're preparing a better catalog for the future. So yeah, I mean, 99% sounds slightly hyperbolic, but to be honest, that's how I feel because it just seems like every time I grab a case and start looking at it closely, it just falls apart. It becomes ashes in my hand. So an enormous frustration. If you were studying any other field as a biologist or I don't know, a historian, and every time you started to look deeply into a battle that happened or whatever, you discovered that battle never actually happened.
Mhm.
It does change your outlook on these things, but that
Well, I
doesn't mean
wonder.
I'm totally skeptical.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wonder how you rationalize that with your own sighting, where you saw something appear in the sky that didn't seem like it should be there, and then disappeared from the sky, which is exactly mirroring many of the reports that, some of them may disappear like cotton candy underwater, but some of them obviously aren't because you saw one. So,
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
how do you, I mean, like this paper that I found online, it was brutal about David Grush and everything he says and everything.
Hmm.
And at one point basically says that people make the mistake of thinking that fighter pilots are good witnesses. They're not. I mean, it's pretty like utterly dismissive of the whole topic
Okay.
and the people who, so I'm just wondering, like, since you have an experience, I'm wondering how you can do both at the same time. It's like you've had the reality and you can't explain it. And your story is exactly probably the kind of stories that you would research. So you have absolute proof that that event did happen the way that you said it did. So why is your story or your experience more trustworthy than the hundreds of thousands of witnesses who claim to have seen them?
I see it in a different way. I see that while I can vouch for one story, which was my own,
Which was
that
extraordinary.
that leaves my own mind open. That leaves my mind open to the possibility that other people's stories are true too.
Yeah.
That is what motivates me to metaphorically get out of bed in the morning and poke around in the archives and take on a case and go into it. That's
Yeah.
what keeps me going, despite the fact so many of the cases that I look into become incredibly doubtful after just 20 minutes of research. I mean, the moment you start building a star map, a constellation map of the moment that, because what happens is the witnesses will say, well, yeah, I saw this weird object in the sky. The moon was over there and Venus was over there. And this happened on a particular day of the year, particular time. You build that up on a kind of digital planetarium and you discover, no, the moon was not there at all. And Venus wasn't even visible at that time and so on. And it becomes very disappointing.
Sure.
You find that with ancient cases too, modern cases. Where do you go with that? But it's as if I mean, obviously, this is not even slightly the case, but if I had seen an angel that night in 1996,
Mhm.
and I find myself in a world surrounded by people with stories about them meeting angels, and I can prove their cases are not true, where do I take my angel story? You know, that was shared by so many other people. It
Mhm.
was a multiple witness case.
Yeah,
It doesn't drive you crazy, but it's very frustrating. But
sure.
that's another reason why I focus on the past,
Yeah,
because that was a period before the sort of mediatic circus that we have today. It was a period of much less media contamination, cultural contamination. If I find the same story in the middle of Africa as I do in the middle of China in the year 1632, it's much more unlikely that there was some kind of contamination going on, and that's why I think that maybe even the future of UFOs is actually in the study of its past, because the
yeah,
past is practically endless, going back thousands of years, and we know that the present and the future can be highly influenced by political biases, nowadays artificial intelligence, and so on. I think we'll end up studying the past more carefully.
yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that in your book, you do a fantastic job of that. And let's get to that. I mean, one of the things that you talk about, I mean, first off, you dissect the sort of the root of the word for the phenomenon of flying saucer, and you sort of track it to this kind of bungling that happens between an AP reporter and the reporter on the ground at the time, and what he actually said, and it becomes this thing. Um, I mean, that sort of is emblematic of what you're talking about, like, right? Like you start to dig into
Mhm.
it, and it's like it turns out that there is no there is no foundation for the actual root of the term. And then you go and you point out that that whole term was part of the skeet shooting, trap shooting phenomenon. Do you want to
That's right.
let's talk about that journey a little bit? I mean, what was your expectations going into the research for the book? And I mean, was that what led you into it? The idea that you knew what the root of flying saucer was, and you wanted to maybe prove to yourself where it came from, or I mean, talk about it for us a little
Hmm.
bit.
Okay, well, around the year 2003, I started an international online research project called Magonia Exchange, which has had members in about 160 different countries. It's
Wow.
been massive, and we've got like 40, 50,000 items in our archives related to experiences in the past, which is such a huge amount of information. It's very difficult to cope with.
Yeah.
I'm also looking forward to the day that AI can help us with that. Anyway, at the moment, I wouldn't trust it. But
Right.
in any case, what I started to do was look for the etymology or the roots of all kinds of expressions, from mothership to little green men to flying saucers, of course, to find out when these expressions truly manifested in the world of the press and in people's mouths, which is the most important thing. Then I realized that, of course, flying saucer appeared in 1916 and 1895, and also even in some references to military operations in the 1940s, all of which predated Kenneth Arnold. And I thought,
Yeah.
this is pretty weird, and this cannot be a coincidence, because flying plus saucer, oh, an interesting sounding combination of nouns, but it's just too coincidental.
Yeah.
So I put together a kind of web page in the year 2004 in which I presented 20 or so examples of this, saying to people, I think I found something, but I don't know what it is. Most people ignored it. A few people now and again tell me, oh, yes, I found that very interesting when I came across it, but I didn't do anything with it. Uh, I think a fragment of this was included in Wikipedia at some point in the past without an actual reference to me. Anyway,
Mhm.
most people said to me, just forget about it. Literally sweep it under the rug. Um, don't even
Well,
I
that's
mean,
not what
don't
I
even
do.
think of, yeah, because
Yeah.
they were like, oh, but that's just a coincidence. Surely that can't have any bearing on absolutely anything. But then that sort of motivated me more, and I wanted to know whether that period of trap shooting, in which literally millions of people between the 1890s and 1947 would have come into contact with the expression
Yeah.
flying saucer on a daily
It
basis.
sounds like it was everywhere. I mean, yeah,
Absolutely, but we've
yeah,
collectively forgotten that. So I wanted to find out more about this. So yeah, I've spent about 15, 16, 17 years making a timeline to show the evolution of that term. And I realized that it definitely does overlap with Kenneth Arnold. And not
yeah,
only that, it solves the question of who coined the expression flying saucer. It's
yeah,
always been a big problem. The first man well, the first two men, Skiff and Beckett, Nolan Skiff and William Beckett,
yeah.
didn't say flying saucer at all in their original articles, but suddenly, miraculously, magically, 2 days later, the country was talking about flying saucers. How could this be? It's very simple. No one coined the word flying saucer. It's just that lots of reporters decided it would be funny to play on this very traditional sporting term.
Hmm.
And because everybody was aware that flying saucer existed, when Kenneth Arnold said that they were like saucers, he
Yeah,
doesn't specifically say, particularly in those articles, in what sense they were like saucers, but he
exactly.
says they
Yeah,
were like saucers. Of course, people jumped on that. They said, "Aha, flying saucers! That's so funny," and they turned it into a thing.
hmm,
But in reality, as I show in the book, it's really because William Beckett, the man most responsible for popularizing Arnold's story right at the beginning,
hmm,
25th, 26th of June, 1947, he forgot to mention one vital fact, and that is Kenneth Arnold said that they had a somewhat bat-shaped
yeah,
appearance.
yeah, yeah.
Their shape was like a bat. That is to say, like a Batman symbol, possibly, which is what
Hmm.
he went on to draw in his own FBI report.
Yeah,
And otherwise, today we would all be talking about bat-shaped alien ships, which I believe were slightly Klingon. I remember a period when Klingon ships were like slightly
yeah,
like that. That would be the standard UFO today, that children would be playing with it. And, it would have a knock-on effect because the Millennium Falcon, the guy who designed the Millennium Falcon for Star Wars, was told to make it slightly like a flying saucer. So he adapted the idea of a flying saucer to create the Millennium Falcon. That would be maybe boomerang shaped. I don't know. And
yeah,
the same thing happened with the Enterprise in Star Trek. That was also based on a flying saucer originally. It just had an appendage and a body to it.
yeah,
What would that look like today? This has had a massive knock-on effect on our culture.
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that you also get into in the book, which is goes toward your premise earlier, that when you go into with these subjects and you really give it a deep and thorough investigation, some of the stuff just kind of dissolves. He wasn't clear. Kenneth Arnold wasn't clear on what he saw, and that seemed to sort of evolve over the course of the story. I mean, you point to the silkscreen image that you show. I think it's silkscreen is the right word, but you show an image that he had on his wall, I guess, of the
Mm-hmm.
and that it looks different than some of the descriptions and some of the earlier drawings that he had done. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, so in his own mind or in his own descriptions, it seemed to evolve. So then you're left with, I mean, this is a formative sighting in the history of ufology. There's 9 saucers flying over, this mountain where he was looking for it. And then all of a sudden, they're not saucers. Maybe they're bat shaped. Maybe only one was bat shaped. What's the reality here? And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I can see how that's, sort of impugns the field as a whole, since that became so formative
Absolutely.
as a way to
Mm-hmm.
study UFOs, or I mean, what kicked off the study of
Yeah, yeah.
UFOs.
Well, I mean, the evolution was really the first reference he ever said was bat-shaped,
Hmm.
which William Beckett omitted from his AP version. That was only published locally in the East Oregonian, and that's what caused, all of the confusion, really.
Yeah.
Um, while Kenneth Arnold was still telling reporters, well, they were like half pie shaped, they were half pan shaped, half plate shaped, always some kind of semicircle with a peak in the middle, very similar to the crescent shape which you've just mentioned that he published in 1950. He was very consistent actually about what
Hmm.
shape they originally had. They were sort of like a semicircle with a peak in it. They could be slightly bent further back or whatever, but he had some idea of a semicircle with a triangular
Point on it.
tail.
Yeah, yeah,
His drawings varied slightly, but of course we're talking about a period in time in which people weren't used to being in the public eye.
yeah.
Um, UFOs didn't really exist as a thing, and he had nothing to compare this to. And the world literally was calling him on the phone, sending him letters continuously. He was
Yeah.
being barraged with requests for more information and so on. Yeah, this definitely morphed in his head. And he did reach a point in which he wasn't sure whether it was one, whether it was nine like this. He definitely doubted this, but of course, he never said that they were round and flat, and that is
Yeah.
the myth that persists to this day. He even had his own theory about this, and until recently, it was believed that only in April 1950 did he come out with the idea that reporters had confused his
The quote, skip
description
like
of
saucers or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
he thought that he must have said that if you skip or skim a saucer across the water, it would move like this, and that's how the reporters got confused. I show in this book that that did not happen.
Nope.
That was Arnold's error. That was his mistake. He got the
Yeah.
right guy, but he got the wrong reason, and
Yeah.
the real reason was simply this: the original reporter omitted the adjective. Bat-shaped in his AP version, and of course, it was the AP edit that reached every state and every newspaper in the country, and that's what caused all of this. So yeah, I mean, and in fact, I should mention that now the Oxford English Dictionary, an editor of the Oxford English Dictionary has contacted me through another person. They would like to amend the history
Well,
of
that
the
is
word
damn
flying
cool.
cysty for the
Yeah.
next edition, and
Yeah.
that's not something that happens every day. I'm
No,
pretty happy about that, you
I
know.
bet. Yeah. Yeah. If you can change the dictionary, you know you're having an effect on the world.
Well, there you go. You see, yeah. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I think this should definitely have an impact. It should at least make people think, particularly those who practically worship the disc. What exactly are they worshiping? I
Yeah.
mean, I show in the book pretty conclusively that the whole idea of the disc, the whole idea of a circular flat thing, came from a confusion which was sparked off by trap shooting, this term in trap shooting.
Hmm.
What does that really mean? That people these days are worshipping a kind of trap shooting disc? I mean, the ramifications are completely nuts. And
Hmm.
I understand why a lot of people are going to say, yeah, come on, get off it, no way. But it's true. This is where the origin lies. And if you take the origin of a lot of things, cartoon characters or everyday expressions, you will go back in time and discover that they come from very surprising sources, like the word for avocado originally meant a part of a male of the male anatomy. I mean, but a lot of people don't realize that these days, you know.
I'll never think of an avocado the same way again.
Okay.
That's fascinating. I mean, so, but there are sightings of discs, right? I mean, like there, you break down in the book at one point that there's a percentage of what the sightings are, and it's a small percentage, but it is a recurring percentage. I mean, if you had seen a disc instead of a rectangle, I mean, at what point is it like, do you have to? I mean, this is it's like an argument for postmodernism or whatever, but like when someone describes something that they've seen, at what point can you just, you know, trust them to be telling their own story accurately? I mean, like if someone said to you, you saw a rectangle and rectangles don't exist, you're going to be like, well, no, I saw one. And I'm sure some people who have been told that who have seen discs are going to be like, well, it may not be what the term comes from, but I know that I saw one. And I'm sure that some people that watch the show are going to be saying exactly that. So
Of course.
what's your answer to that, I guess?
Well, the problem with a disc is something that Jacques Vallée explained to me a very long time ago. And that is, if you're on the ground looking up, there is no way to distinguish between a disc and a sphere.
Right.
If you're looking at a sphere, you don't know if it's a disc. There are people these days who don't know if the world is disc shaped or spherical. But that's another matter, I suppose.
Right.
But the fact is, there is no way of looking at the moon and saying, oh, that must be a plate, a very thin plate stuck in the sky, or whether it's a ball. So when you start looking at the actual databases of UFO reports, many of those classified as saucers, dishes, plate-shaped, thin, with a dome or whatever. When you look at the details, they very often say, well, we couldn't really see what it looked like, that it was round. Well, half the time they're not even round. So that I begin to doubt that that 2% is accurate. I think
Yeah.
that what we really need is, because that's what it is, it's 2% in most
Yeah.
of these data.
Okay.
98% of UFOs are not disc-shaped at all. And then
Yeah.
when you look at that 2%, it's often not, it wasn't a disc either.
Yeah.
I think that what we really need in ufology is a kind of little revolution. We need to let go of the disc. We
Yeah.
need to stop jumping every time we see a disc in a medieval religious painting, or oh my God, another disc, or it's a prehistoric painting somewhere in France. It looks like they're looking at a disc shape in the sky. I think this is what holds ufology back. Yeah, maybe there are disc-shaped UFOs. Fine, I'm quite happy with that. And if someone says that they've seen one, that's great. But that still probably just makes up part of the 2%,
Yeah.
and less than 2%. If you look at it historically, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book,
Hmm.
up until the 24th of June, 1947, discs were entirely absent from the historical record. There were plenty of UFOs, which is why I decided to paint a picture of what the UFO landscape was like before 1947.
Yeah.
But discs were not there. I found that with Jacques Vallée when we did a redo of Wonders in the Sky, and we made this
Oh,
mammoth
wow.
looking book here
Wow.
a
That's
few years
gorgeous.
ago. We corrected a lot of the errors. Lots and lots of photos and pictures in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still need to make a new one. We just couldn't support the notion that there were disc-shaped UFOs. And I found that in the archives that we were looking at, half the time it was actually saying things like a disc-shaped UFO seen over Italy in 1722. You look at it, there was no disc. It's like an instinct that ufologists have to call everything a disc,
Yeah.
because flying saucer was the shorthand for alien spaceship for
Hmm.
decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the same way, and I make this argument in the book, that ghosts wearing white sheets are the shorthand for ghosts even today, even when nobody sees ghosts wearing white sheets. And most of the population doesn't even know why we ever imagined they were wearing white sheets at all. Of course, they were burial shrouds.
Yeah.
These days, ghosts don't need burial shrouds to move around, because we don't
Yeah.
imagine that they're really dead bodies being resuscitated.
Hey, someone just came in. Hey, dogs. So one thing I wanted to talk to you about that's related to all this is the priming issue. I mean, you list several authors who, and I have you have like, sorry, Rome, De La Hire, Atke, Ray Cummings, I guess. Ray Palmer might be another one. Authors who sort of prefigured the whole
Mm-hmm.
notion of alien visitation and,
Mm-hmm.
things flying around in the sky. I mean, from your perspective now, how much do you think that is at root with the whole phenomenon?
This book is the first study of the origins of ufology and where it all comes from. And I
Okay.
published this last November. This is volume 1. It's called Alien Artifacts. I published through Amazon because they give you a lot of freedom to update manuscripts and to publish it as quickly as you'd like and to use all the images that you want.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's volume 1. It's been very, very well received. And what I do is I go back in time to the earliest beliefs in extraterrestrial life, which would be the atomists of ancient Greece. I bring that forward to medieval times when it was debated in Catholicism by the most important bishops and spokesmen of the Catholic Church, whether extraterrestrials should be a part of Catholic dogma or not, and they voted that it was. Basically, they said we should take into consideration that God would not have created this universe only for us, and he didn't have to let us know if we're not the only people in it. And then from the 18th, 19th century onwards, we see ufology really become seeded in various places at the same time all over the world, and how that flourished to become the ufology of today. What I show in this book, for example, and I think this should be celebrated because no one's going to do it, let's do it ourselves. This is 200. This is the 200th anniversary of the ancient aliens theory, which you can believe or disbelieve. I have my own opinions,
Yeah.
but it was 1823 that started. 1823, a book was published that said another planet contained a civilization, and when that planet was destroyed, they came here and seeded and civilized our own, the Earth,
Mm-hmm.
and that a lot of our civilizations come from that period. I mean, you can even find the pyramids, the Easter Island statues. All of this was spoken about in the 1860s, 1880s. So when we talk about the origins of ufology and how that's reflected in science fiction, as in the authors that you've mentioned there, yeah, it's quite understandable that that would happen. And then what I show in this book is that sources were totally absent until 1887. And I don't believe that this is a coincidence. I can't prove it, but it would be strange if this were not the case. I believe that just as the whole world was using, particularly in America and England, we're using flying discs, clay pigeons, flying saucers was the name for them.
Yeah.
They were using this constantly as the major sport in America. This was a massive sport up there with the greatest sports in the country. It was competing against golf and football for a long time. Just then, we find pulp fiction, science fiction, using disc shapes as the natural vehicle for sky travelers and aliens from other planets. Of course, because they're seeing them whizzing across the sky continuously. So yeah, what we find is that science fiction really laid the roots for what would later become ufology. But those coincidences are quite easily explained when you look at it culturally, and you know, in that sense. So I don't think it's a coincidence that flying saucers landed in science fiction in the same period that trap shooting was so popular.
Yeah, there was one thing that you said a few minutes ago about, like, what does it say that we're shooting what we call flying saucers, which extends from something that we used to shoot out of the sky as the sport. I mean, in America, of course, we're at the heart of, gun culture, the NRA, that whole thing. I mean, there's a mindset that goes along with it. What do you think it says? What do you think? What does it say to you?
About what? About American people?
Well, no, just the idea that, I mean, we're the flying saucers were what we've turned, we use that term to use to explain spaceships, but it comes from something that we shot out of the sky with.
It's amazingly poetical in a sense, isn't it? That a country which not only supports gun culture. I wouldn't say 100% of Americans, of course, support gun culture, but it is a big topic in America. It's also a country which talks about crash landing, flying saucer shaped objects that constantly seem to land in New Mexico for mysterious reasons, and the whole idea of flying saucer. I mean, the flying saucer might also have come from that. It's poetical. It's literary. It could be a novel. You could turn this into a sort of artsy movie, because it's just amazing how it all seems to be connected. If you look at it from a historical perspective, of course, all of this has happened in the same 100-year period. Yeah. In fact, if you think about it, the idea of clay pigeons and flying saucers in that sense wasn't invented until about 1881. Arnold's flying saucer appeared on the scene just 60 years later, and 60 years really is not a lot of time if you think about how long ago Elvis Presley was singing on stage. It's not that long ago. So historically, it does all seem to be quite connected and rather ironic, I think, is what you're getting at, and yeah, I agree with it.
But I was hoping that you would say it, and you did. So
it's true. It's true.
Yeah. What do you? I mean, as someone who is obviously, I mean, you have thoroughly researched the topic. You are probably, from my angle at least, one of the more competent researchers on the subject, because you go deep and you're looking at the history and the context and everything else. I haven't read Alien Artifacts, but now I will. But my question is, how would you advise people who are taking this topic up now I mean, to move forward? I mean, has it become so polluted in your mind by, these cultural artifacts and everything else that there's no way to really get at the truth of it? Or what? What would you tell someone who's just starting out?
I hate to sound like a secondary school teacher, but the studying history is our key to understanding the present and the future.
Hmm.
History is not a very fashionable subject. It's never been particularly fashionable. Young people hate it. But honestly, the only way that we can understand what's going on now is to be aware of the roots of all this in the past. The only way to stop falling into traps, intellectual traps, with this bombardment of misinformation that we're all experiencing, is by defending ourselves, by understanding the roots of all of this. In this book, Alien Artifacts, in the second and third volume I want to publish this year, and so on. What I show is that the parallels are so deep between the past and the present, and no doubt the future, that if you don't at least read one book on UFO history in your life, and I would recommend this one to know where ufology comes from, and this one to know where flying saucers comes from.
Hmm.
Uh, they can get it from Amazon and return it. I don't care. The only thing that what
Yeah.
interests me is that people read about it, become aware of it, and to protect themselves from so much nonsense that's being published through Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all over the place. Because if not, they'll grow up, or just continue growing if they're already old, with a very twisted view of the reality of UFOs. I would also recommend that they try to look beyond the disc shape and try to get that out of their minds somehow. The
Yeah.
idea that UFOs are naturally. I've had to put one on the front of this book, not because I support the idea, but if I don't put a UFO of this shape on this book, people won't know what it is. It's crazy. It's
Yeah.
that's how nuts it is. I mean, try to abandon the shape of a disc-shaped UFO. I think that is the first step towards freeing your mind and accepting that maybe, yeah, maybe there are strange things going on in the world, but they're not necessarily what we thought they were going to be. You
Yeah.
know, it's so difficult. It's the whole idea of a disc-shaped UFO is like a tattoo on our minds, culturally speaking. Sorry, I
Yeah.
was just thinking I couldn't. I have to say, you were talking about the connection between trap shooting and gun culture and so on, and the
Hmm.
flying saucers, and how
Yeah.
ironic that is. I just thought that a few months before Arnold's sighting, in October 1946, that was the real genesis of the modern era of UFOs. That was the
Mhm.
first time someone saw one flying over. That was bullet shaped. I just I just realized that. That's quite
Wow.
interesting. How
Yeah. Yeah.
from bullets to flying saucers. I could write that into a chapter, but yeah, it's just interesting. But
It
you
sounds
see,
like you
these
could.
connections, you can only make these connections by knowing something about the past, becoming aware of it, and that also helps you interpret other kinds of information, whether it's political, historical, sociological, about society, drug use, whatever. Know something about where all this has really come from. Pick up a good a good book on this subject every now and again. I'm sure you do.
I do. I read a lot of books, and a lot of them are about this topic, probably too many. Real quick before we wrap this up, what is your current verdict of where things have been going? I mean, we talk about the paper that your name is on, but I mean, I don't know if that expresses your full view of like where, I mean, this whole Grush phenomenon, with or without him, or the whistleblowers on Capitol Hill, the American government does seem to be taking things seriously. Sean Kirkpatrick has said that there are things flying around that we can't necessarily explain. Other people have said more. There's government sources who come out and always say that I learned this and this is what's going on. I mean, are you intrigued by that information at all, or does your knowledge of what you've studied in the past, kind of make it that much harder for you to buy into all the stuff that comes out in terms of, you know, leaks and whatnot?
Well, again, I have to look at this as a kind of historian, as an observer of all of this. If you go back in time to the 1940s, 50s, people were writing articles saying we're about to find out the truth. The government is about to tell us. Can't you feel it in the air? I can certainly feel it. Whatever. If you go back to the
But
19th
this time it's
century, it was
true.
a very similar. And this time it's true. But you get this every 10 or 20 years. It seems to be a generational thing. I don't mean that each time it's with young people representing whistleblowers or whatever. It's not a generational thing in that sense, but at least every 15, 20 years, we see the same thing. The only thing I can say is that this time is probably here to stay, because in the era of the internet, things don't get deleted from public record as quickly as they did when we depended on books. I could talk about books that nobody's ever heard of, and you won't even come up in a Google search. But from this time on, we're going to find tales of whistleblowers from this period. I mean, even when we're in our 70s and 80s. So this is not going to go away. It also reminds me of in a positive way in the 19th century, when in the 1890s, when the airship waves were becoming very popular, people were accepted that there were thousands of airship sightings happening all over the place. And then people of all ages, 16, 17, 90, would go out of their houses, look in the sky and say, hey, I've seen one too. And they would report their sightings to the local newspaper, but they wouldn't have done in a previous period when that hadn't been fashionable or socially acceptable. So I think that what might happen now, this would be my prediction at least, is that now that these things are being spoken about more and more, we're going to hear of more sightings, many, many more sightings from this point onwards. We'll hear about, well, my uncle told me this and he said never to tell anybody, and I saw this when I was a kid. We're going to find so much more information because we're losing that sense of stigma about it.
That's a good thing, though, right? Or I mean, what do you think?
That's a great thing. That's a great thing. I think that the more data we can get, the better. Again, I believe that at some point in the future, we're going to find an artificial intelligence system able to deal with these data without hallucinating and without biases, and it might make a small meal out of the whole UFO phenomenon and come to conclusions that we don't expect. But that's great too. We learn something about human
ourselves. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And cognition and what we project if that does come to pass. I keep hearing the story of AI. I mean, I'm going to be interviewing Diana Pasulka, the writer, in a month or so, and I got an advanced copy of her book, and she talks a little bit about AI and what that is, and how some AI researchers now, I mean, how it they think that might be behind the UFO phenomenon. I mean, it's theorizing and conjecture, but it's fascinating. Anyway, so that keeps coming up. I need to do some research.
Well,
it's going to get worse, right?
Until it becomes totally normalized. ChatGPT 4, I noticed the other day that I have access to the possibility of uploading an image and saying, what do you see? What can I do with this? The typical take a photo of your fridge and say, what ingredients do you see and what can I do with this? It is incredible what it can do. So it won't be long before we'll start uploading photographs of UFOs and other things and videos and saying, what do you make of this? And maybe right now it's not going to give us a very clear opinion or a very well done analysis, but in a very short time that's going to happen, and that will be another change.
It's a matter of iterations, right? So the more we put into it to say, what is this, or how does this work, or analyze, it gets better and better and better. And I mean, that
it's
on one hand, it puts the mystery at risk, I'm sorry, good at finding patterns. Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to ask you about real quick, Trinity, the book, Jacques Vallée's book with Paola Harris. I interviewed Jacques on my show, Headline Humboldt, and I was absolutely thrilled to have him on, and brilliant conversation. But there's been some criticism lately because there were some investigations done by Dean Douglas and others that showed that the story might not be all that it was cracked up to be, and there were some accusations about Jose Padilla, who's one of the witnesses and whatnot. What are your thoughts on that? And is it something that we should draw a moral lesson from, or what?
I think that this is just one of probably about 25 very similar cases that I could tell you about, stretching back from the 1840s to the 1980s, which are very, very similar. It's just people inventing stories to get information, sorry, to get the attention of authorities or authority figures, and trying to turn that into cash. And that is exactly what happened in with the Trinity UFO. It's been so incredibly well dismantled. It's been analyzed to death, which it deserved to be, whether it was true or not. I mean, it deserved to receive so much attention from us, as anything does in this day of age. It was very easy to tear apart, and their
Yeah.
stories were very easy to show. They just contained contradictions, and their versions altered over time. And of course, I mention the case in my book in passing, because I say even pranksters have reached the conclusion that that ufologists are not really interested in saucer-shaped objects anymore, and they turned their flying saucer into an avocado in a very short period of time. One year, they said they were telling researchers it was flying saucer shaped because, of course, it seemed like that would attract attention. When they realized that nobody cared, they said, no, it was avocado shaped. And then, of course, everybody, oh, that's very interesting. That's unusual. We have to look into this. Even pranksters realize that the flying saucer is something of the past and should
Yeah.
remain there.
Well, and now that we know that avocado has a whole different root and meaning, it changes the complexion of the story entirely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll call him tonight and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, yeah. So now, real quick, I mean, your art is everywhere in the book. The book is beautifully laid out. Honestly, I read a lot of books, and some of the ones that are independently published are often not very well put together, and this is a beautiful volume. So and I've got the paperback, not the hardback, so I imagine it's even cooler when it's in hardback. Can you talk a little bit about your artistic process and how you figured out what you wanted to illustrate and why, and how you went about that?
Okay, right. So when I was writing this book, I was practically finishing it, and it's quite difficult to find pictures to illustrate a book about things that happened 200 years ago. One solution is just to put in little fragments of text from newspapers, but it's so boring. No one's interested in that. And then suddenly, while I was doing it, they brought out Dali Dos, sorry, Dos. I'm saying it in Spanish. Apologies. I'm constantly speaking it. My life here is half Spanish, half English. Dali 2, the AI for generating images.
Yeah.
And that really helped me put the finishing touches to it, because finally you can show, you can put details of a story that has only existed without illustrations in people's minds for 200 or 300 years, and bring it to life for the first time in seconds. And I thought, wow, that is a revolution, and it really helped. And then in this one, I've decided to run with it, in the sense that why not do that? Take it to the next level. And it doesn't only contain AI generated images. There's a lot of images from a lot of different sources, but I thought I really need to make the book more memorable and makes history interesting to read. And the result has been people have saying to me, it's much more of a page turner, because while you're reading it, you don't know what picture you're going to see. You don't know how you're going to illustrate it. I mean, most of these, for example, I've taken from the original pulp magazines that are out of copyright.
That is so cool.
And I like to play, I like to allow the images to interact with the text as much as possible.
Yeah.
It's also because young people today, and I apologize to all the young people. Excuse me, I have a, yeah, okay. Sorry, I had an incoming call. I apologize to all the young people who are not feeling the same, but most people young people have a very low attention span these days for reading. I give classes to a lot of people between the age of 15 and 28. Very few of them have actually read books voluntarily in their lives. But when you give them a book which is illustrated in such a way that it looks almost as if it were a comic, it doesn't look like a comic, but at least it's got interesting or funny pictures.
It's graphically compelling.
they will read my talk of history and people who died 60 years ago, and that helps. I think it's so important to the field that people become aware of how it started. You're not going to get that if you just publish a basic black and white text. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
People these days have changed. People's minds have changed in that sense. And a couple of people have said to me, "Why have you done that? Was that a good idea?" And I think, yeah, sorry, it really was. Clearly, it wasn't for you. It was for other people who find the interplay between image and text to be helpful to remember, to learn something, or simply to turn the page.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that's what's interesting about it. It's not just it's like that you have watermarks and you have things that are sort of surrounding it. I mean, it's really well put together, and it's not typical in terms of there being, a drawing on this page, text on this page, or whatever. It's interesting and well done. That's
thank
pretty
you.
much all I had for you. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or are you good?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for talking to me today.
Oh, no,
And
my pleasure.
yeah,
Absolutely, my
and
pleasure. You're
whenever you come to this part of Spain, drop in. Drop me
yeah, you
a
promised me a
line and we'll
vacation,
meet.
so are
Absolutely,
you
of
in
course.
Madrid?
Yeah.
Madrid
No,
proper,
not
or
now. I was living in Madrid for 19 years, and then I started here in a place called Cáceres, which is a beautiful medieval town in the sort of center of Spain,
yeah.
in a region called Extremadura, and it's a wonderful place. When I came here when I was 19 years old, it's quite a strange and complicated story, but I was mugged in the street
Oh no.
on an adventure while I was traveling to Africa, and I never got there. And I ended up sleeping in the street for 7 weeks. And
Wow.
it's a long and strange story I might write about one day. But
Yeah.
during that process, I learned Spanish. I ended up living in this, as I said, this wonderful medieval town called Cáceres. And since then, I've just lived in Spain ever, since 19. I arrived on the 4th of March, 1991. I've never really left,
Yeah.
and I'll probably stay here forever. Currently, I'm living in Badajoz, which is another town near Cáceres, but I don't know. I seem to flip between the two places, and Madrid was beautiful too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting life, and you're only here once, and
Yeah.
I
Absolutely.
gravitate towards interesting places with nice people in them,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely. Interestingly, my father-in-law right now is in Portugal. He's doing a pilgrimage. He's not Catholic, but they have these walks where people go on, and it lasts several weeks. And he's been
October the 13th is Fatima anyway, isn't it? So
yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
mhm,
I forgot about that. October
mhm.
13th was Fatima. See, there's another one of those chains of weird things. It was an eclipse
Well,
today. It's the Fatima anniversary. I mean, it's just piling up. It must mean something cosmic.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you. Hmm.
All right, sir. I appreciate it. I will put this together, probably publish either later tonight or tomorrow, and I'll send you a link. And I appreciate you taking the time out of your life to meet with me. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I learned a lot
Sorry
from
about
your
it.
book.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you liked it, and if I manage to sell a couple, I can pay for the annual cost of keeping the Magonia website in
So
place
that is
because it's
ongoing then. What's the URL?
yes,
I
it
mean,
is.
I
Yeah,
can look it up, but I'll put that in the
it
description as well as
doesn't
each of the
really it
books.
doesn't really have one anymore, but you just put in Magonia Exchange and it's .io.
Okay.
Maybe I don't know because we've had to change servers since Yahoo stopped doing Yahoo Groups,
Okay.
and it's worked very well. It's slower these days than it was, but I mean, we still get a drip of maybe 3 or 4 posts per week, or maybe even 15 or 20. But
Wow.
every single post is a case. Very few are commentaries on cases. So it means that we've managed to build up this massive, massive, massive archive, a
Yeah.
huge library of Fortean stories from before 1947. That's the rule, that everything has to be from before 1947. And it's, as I said, it's 20 years of that too. This is massive. I mean, there's so much to do, so much to see, and I'm continually finding new things, which I've learned my lesson. Don't tell people that you're about to publish a book, because that means you're bound to find something new the next day, and that's what's happened with sources which I announced
Right.
in August, maybe. I don't know when. It's embarrassing now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
So
The info just keeps coming, right? Falling from the sky like
it's
saucers.
the digitalization of the world's libraries. It's just so continuous,
Yeah.
and only one person can only see so much. So the merrier. If anybody who watches or listens to this wants to join in, that'll be great.